All right, it is now my privilege to bring to you Miss Lily Cardwell and her paper, The Idea of a Story.
Winter, December 1620 in Plymouth. A mother and her daughter sit huddled in a tent, bracing themselves against the chill brought by the raging wind outside. Between the lack of food and the horror of the slowly increasing death count, spirits are low and sinking. The mother looks at the daughter wrapped in her arms and, seeing the fear and frailty written on her face, opens a nearby bag. She takes up a book and flips through the pages to begin the story of Don Quixote. The daughter sits in silence, closing her eyes to envision the wild, colorful adventure of the knight-errant and his valiant companion. Just as the hero was about to defeat the horrible windmills, the young girl interrupted. "Was he real?" The mother smiled. "No, but it certainly seems plausible, doesn't it?" "Well, then where did he come from?" The mother ponders the question and replies, "Well, the author, I suppose. He composed an idea and wrote it down." Why? Why? Perhaps a question some have asked and others have never even stopped to contemplate or care about. Why do authors write stories, and why do we need them? Almost every person, whether child or adult, can remember being told a fairy tale, a legend, or a family story from the time they were old enough to recollect. It's a beautiful reality that no man knows every story. There are stories of old fables that finish with morals, causing the reader to laugh and ponder the ridiculousness of the character's stupidity. There are fairy tales often littered with princesses, princes, heroes, and villains. Children fall in love with the mystic air of the fantasy world. There are historical stories. Authors write of the true tales of old, or use their imagination to write of a separate view to such a travesty as war. There are classics, riddled with famous tales and written by famed writers. And finally, there are the stories of life, the story each man carries. Every little detail known to him alone, the tale of a human's journey to the end. Each of these stories holds places in hearts all over the world, but the question remains as to why man should dwell on the fantastical, the stories that matter not to him. Should not a man spend his days in total productivity studying sciences, writings, theology, philosophy, and the like? Why should men, knowledgeable or otherwise, be encouraged to enter into a fictional world where nothing is found but false tales and make-believe characters? For is this not the base of a story? And why should good Christian men read such stories of other gods and horrific fates? For is this not dishonorable to God? In order to answer this inquiry, let the readers explore the depths of the classics, the books that men spent years of their lives writing, to seek to understand the morals behind a story and why an author would spend such time writing of a fictional world. Readers should first seek to see the commonalities between philosophies and stories. Philosophers such as Plato used analogies and legends to express their points. The tale of Gyges' ring is not unknown to many scholarly minds. The legend states that the ring can make the wearer invisible at will, freeing him from the judging eyes of others. Without such accountability, Plato questions how a man might act with such potentially reckless freedom. The ring, of course, was not real, but the point of the fiction was to better reveal to the reader what Plato sought to teach. This tale had a moral, hidden or otherwise, and compares with most stories in this way. All stories have an ending, whether left to the reader's imagination or written plain on the page, and the endings reveal the point of the story. Some of the most famous parables in history were told by Jesus in order to illustrate Christian morals. Lessons are hidden in the legends, and therefore presented shortly shall be three classic works: Homer's Odyssey, Antigone and Oedipus from the three Theban plays, and Paradise Lost. Each work contains different revealed or hidden morals and challenges. Let the reader hear and absorb the masterpieces, not tuning out the instructions which they may give. Additionally, let the reader approach the masterpieces with a Christian mindset, seeking to turn all glory and learning back to the ultimate source. Amid piles of unfinished homework, a boy sits before a computer, his face illuminated by the glowing light of a screen. He types away furiously, then hits one last button and sits back with a sigh. Looking around him for a relief from the monotonous task, he brushes away papers, only to find a thick paperback book sitting underneath. He smiles and picks it up, opening it to a bookmarked page, escaping to the world of the sea. Homer's famous Odyssey describes the nostos of Odysseus. The hero is pursued by the wrath of the god Poseidon, who seeks to avenge his son, Polyphemus. The story of Odysseus and Polyphemus began as most stories in the Odyssey start. Odysseus and his men made a mistake. They stumble upon a cave after a meal of wild goat and, finding sheep, milk, and cheese, decide to take some of the goods. The men desire to take the cheeses, get them stowed, and make a run for it. But Odysseus foolishly dawdles. His men's warnings were proven well-founded when the Cyclops master of the cave, Polyphemus, returns. At first he's hospitable, but his attitude soon changes. He eats 2 of the men and keeps Odysseus and the rest of the men imprisoned. While the monster sleeps, Odysseus, knowing he cannot kill the beast until the giant stone at the mouth of the cave is moved, lays out a plan. While Polyphemus tends to his sheep the next day, Odysseus discovers an uprooted tree in the recesses of the cave, hardening it in the fire to solidify the next stage of his plot. When the giant returns that evening, Odysseus immediately offers him wine from their ship, which the Cyclops gladly accepts. Unaware that he is playing into the hands of his captives, Polyphemus drinks until he's intoxicated, quickly changing to a rather jovial attitude under the effect of the alcohol. He asks Odysseus his name, but the hero, knowing better than to reveal his true identity, calls himself Nobody. Succumbing soon to the effects of the rich drink, Polyphemus falls asleep where he sits. Odysseus, seizing the opportunity, stabs the eye of the brute with a prepared wooden stake. The beast's awake, screaming for help. Fellow Cyclops rush to see what has occurred, but turn away at the first few cries of, "Nobody's tricked me! Nobody's ruined me!" The next morning, the blinded Polyphemus opens the cave door to release his sheep, unaware that Odysseus and his men are hiding on the herd's underbellies. They pass undiscovered by their captor and into the open where they make for their ships. Polyphemus, becoming aware of their deception, hears the call of Odysseus that reveals the hero's true identity. "Cyclops, if ever mortal man should inquire how you were put to shame and blinded, tell him Odysseus, raider of cities, took your eye." This unveiling of his true name would bring the full wrath of Poseidon down upon the clever but prideful victor. This was not an end to the hero's travels, but let the readers closely observe this recounted tale of clever tricks and daring escapes. The story is not void of hidden morals to be understood. Odysseus could have avoided these troubles altogether if he had heeded the words of his men to not linger. How many times have men found themselves wandering dangerously into little sins just to see what it might be like to indulge, ignoring the words of Scripture to flee from temptation? How many more times have these same men found themselves lost and tangled in webs of inescapable lies and habits, captivated by their own choices? Odysseus also allowed himself to succumb to his pride by ensuring the monster knew who had fooled him. Had the wayfaring seaman held his tongue, he might not have faced the wrath of a god set on revenge. Men often allow their pride to be their downfall, a blow struck by their own wagging tongue. Proverbs 8:21 says, "Death and life are in the power of the tongue, and those who love it will eat its fruits." Gossip, slander, lies, and boasting all stem from a prideful heart playing upon an untamed tongue, and one, as can be observed in Odysseus' tale, often returned to remind one of what he said. Allow the reader to see the story through the eyes of the monster. Polyphemus considered himself in control, so he allowed his guard to drop, but that became his downfall. Men often find themselves in groups of peers or supposed friends who they know are untrustworthy and negative influences. They consider themselves in charge and strong enough to resist any temptation or pressure. Slowly, however, the more they give in, the more ground that they lose. Soon they slip and fall into the ways of temptation, now set upon by the very sins they claim to have the power to resist. These lessons can be understood from a Christian perspective, even when portrayed in a pagan light. When man does not follow God, he follows sin. The story shows the downfalls that are the results of the very sins the Bible warns men to beware of. But let the reader not linger in the salty sea. Instead, let them tread upon other ground to a world of family versus government and unfortunate mishaps. The clatter of stage equipment sounded through the backstage of a high school theater as 20 teens prepared to present a play. Laughter from the wings could be heard, shortly followed by scattered comments. "I still can't believe he married his mother. He was her family. How could she not honor him? She disobeyed the king. She's obviously wrong." Known commonly as the three Theban plays, the stories of Oedipus, Antigone, and Creon have been eliciting both disgust, debate, and discussion since they were written in the early 5th century. Oedipus is the crowned king of Thebes, married to the beautiful queen Jocasta, but now his city is in turmoil. Plague has struck, and his brother-in-law Creon reports that the plague will only be lifted when the murderer of the previous king is discovered. Banish the man or pay back blood with blood. Oedipus determines to solve the mystery and promises exile when the murderer is found, even if the murderer should be in his own family. When Jocasta tells him of how the murder happened, Oedipus is shocked with familiarity. He tells of his own past when on his journey to Thebes he met a group of travelers who attacked him. In self-defense he slayed all but one, a story that matches perfectly with the tale of the king's death. When a messenger abruptly arrives from Corinth with the news of the king of Corinth's death and reveals that they truly are not Oedipus's parents, the climax of the story is disclosed. Oedipus discovered that he was given to a shepherd of Corinth by a shepherd from Thebes, by order of the king of Thebes, in an attempt to prevent the son from his fated killing of his father. Oedipus, however, was given to the king and queen of Corinth to be raised as their son, but unaware of his prophesied future, eventually ended up fulfilling the inevitable fate of killing his father and marrying his mother, Jocasta. The Theban plays do not end with the story of Oedipus, however. One of the three plays focuses on the famed tale of Antigone, Oedipus's daughter, and his brother-in-law, Creon. When Polynices, Antigone's brother, leads an attack against Thebes and dies in a duel against his own brother in the process, Creon, the current king, declares him a traitor and decrees that whoever mourns or buries him shall be put to death. He must be left unburied, his corpse carrion for the birds and dogs to tear, an obscenity for all citizens to behold. Antigone, determining that family matters more than the law, disobeys and commits herself to the burying of her fallen brother. When the new king, Creon, discovers this, he determines to remain true to his first decree and punish Antigone's disobedience with death. The tale continues, but the main question has been uncovered. In such a scenario, what should be held in higher respect? The law or family? Why are such revolting stories retold and discussed? In Oedipus, nothing but unfortunate darkness seems to appear, the doomed fate of one man inescapable. How might a reader approach such a story in a Christian light? One can observe the fate of Oedipus as one that was not set for his own good, but simply as his fate. Christians can find comfort in Romans 8:28, in which it is stated that God works all things out for the good of those who love him and are called according to his purpose. All Christians possess a reassurance that was not present in the heart of Oedipus, that everything, no matter how difficult or painful, works in a process for their sanctification. This story reminds the Christian reader how fortunate they are to live under a God who desires only good for them. Whether or not this was the intent of the author, Sophocles, the reader can understand the pagan story from this Christian view. And what of the story of Antigone and Creon? What's the point of a story that ends in no resolve but in the death of the adversary to escape the conflict? From a philosophical view, the reader might observe that the point is an unanswered ending. A book without resolution makes the reader attempt to figure out the correct ending themselves, in turn sparking questions that the reader might not have asked otherwise. In this case, the reader might argue that nothing outweighs the importance of family if the choice between the family and the law arises. Another reader might counter that without obedience solely to the law, society will fall ultimately into decay and into separate, chosen moral dedications. These conflicting and unresolved mindsets have caused arguments since the book was written, but the beauty of the piece is found in such occurrences. Readers will be prepared to answer such a difficult question in a real-life scenario if such a difficulty should present itself. These two gruesome and disputed stories, while a famous representation of a classic, are not the final theme to be studied in the search for the justification of a story. The old library was filled with shelf after shelf of books, the pages all yellowed with years of aging. A young college student looks up in wonder to study the titles written in gold lettering on the side. Her eyes fell on one beautifully decorated book, Paradise Lost. Intrigued by the magical-sounding title, she pulled it down and opened it. Reading through the pages, she slowly became lost in the writer's interpretation of the Garden of Eden. John Milton's beautiful interpretation of what the beginning of the world might have looked like elicits a response from the reader that is nothing short of awe. Just one of Milton's poetic lines, such as, "Circle his throne, rejoicing ye in heaven, on earth join all ye creatures to extol him first, him last, him midst, and without end, fairest of stars, last in the train of night," captivates the reader into this sparkling description. Milton's begin by painting a picture of hell, the demons now trapped inside and seeking revenge on their captor. On the suggestion of corrupting God's new creation, Satan departs for earth. There he whispers in the ear of Eve his first temptations to taste of the forbidden fruit, that he might taint the animal spirits that from pure blood arise, vain hopes, vain aims, and inordinate desires. Adam and Eve awake, thus far obedient, and find the angel Raphael sent by God to warn them of Satan's dangers. He tells them of the fall of Satan, of the creation of the universe. Adam interrupts with unending questions, but Raphael warns Adam to beware of his desire for knowledge. Inevitably, Satan returns to tempt Eve, who is working alone in the garden. The story follows the narrative of the Bible, Adam soon falling into the same temptation as his wife. Adam and Eve begin to blame each other after God's punishment is announced. Adam angry that Eve was ever created. Eve defeatedly accepting the blame and desiring suicide. The two determine first that they can survive by loving each other, but realize that true life is living in obedience to God. Readers may look on this story as blasphemous, as it seems that the writer is trying to interpret the very details of creation that were hidden from human eyes. But when the idea is raised that Milton does not intend for the reader to take the story as the actual occurrences, the point of the poem becomes more apparent. First, the poem might make one marvel at the genuine beauty of creation. Milton describes the garden in such stunning detail, but when one steps outside, he's reminded of the very elements of the garden growing right outside for his enjoyment. Second, a reader might be reminded of the very present and real evil of Satan himself. He is not a silent foe, nor one who deems anyone too useless to sin. His purpose is evil. To every human, he is a temptation. The story creates a physical sense and a reminder of the enemy who constantly lurks in the paths of men. As is seen in the tale, he's easily hidden and excused in daily life, but his effect is catastrophic. Finally, the reader might relate to the reactions of Adam and Eve towards one another. It's simple in tragic times to blame anyone else involved, anyone but oneself. It's also easy to desire the purposeful end of life as Eve desired in suicide. When the dust clears, it's again an almost immediate reaction of many to resort to the love of other things or one another instead of love for their Creator. These reactions depicted in the story can be understood as a warning and a reminder to man to beware of his own nature, a reminder that apart from God, man will fall. The story, while inspired by the Bible, is still fictional. It contains many life lessons that can teach the reader in a way only a story can. All these stories lead to the same question. Why bother to read them? If Christians are told to spend their lives glorifying God, why should they read stories of pride, pagan gods, and biblical fiction? The answer can be found by observing the life of any man who seeks solely to find answers to the mysteries of life. Through science, theology, and pondering, he pieces life together bit by bit, each day fitting a new piece to his puzzle. It's easy for him to believe that through this, he has all the answers. Life is simpler with all the answers, but something in his life is lacking: fulfillment. Without a purpose for these answers or himself, he's lost in his world of science. The classics to him seem as nothing but stories to read with his own moral compass. Even as Milton wrote, there is a danger to desiring knowledge. It is not for men to know everything. As Isaiah 55 says, "For my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways." Man may ask what there is to life, if not knowledge. To that, the biblical scholar may reply, to live. Everything man does, learning or not, should be raised to the glory of God. Learning to live is a lesson that stories often teach. The time it takes to read a book and enjoy the fables and teaching inside is a time of patience and enjoyment. Men are foolish and forgetful, straying from basic teachings constantly. Books can bring all sorts of reminders to readers who need to remember exactly what the book is teaching. Times like these, mixed in with daily life, remind the busy or worried man to breathe and relax. Man may find such intrigue in the fiction because he knows there is so much he cannot know. The hidden mysteries of life fascinate him. And finally, all stories have a hero. Christians may read and either thank God for his mercy and his guidance, or praise him for winning the battle of salvation. The Bible itself is a story. The hero that man needed is Jesus, and the ending is already secured, if not yet written. Man does not live in an apo misanis theos, where the ending is a twisted and badly written, unpredictable finish. Let the Christians then read to their heart's content, constantly keeping an eye out for lessons that may guide them, or a chance to be thankful for their own life in the hands of the Father. If nothing more, let the excitement of the story's hero remind one to have such excitement over the true hero. Let all one does reflect back to God and his morals, and let man love to live in the little things and the mysteries of life. Every life is a story written by the ultimate author, and the joy of understanding such a plot is one to be hoped man will never stop loving.
Very nicely read, Miss Cardwell, as always, with great drama.
Thank you.
I would like to begin. I had a friend of mine tell me a very interesting story that he had talking to a Polish painter one time. And the painter had painted an interesting picture of kind of the vault of the clouds and the heavens weighing very heavily, very gray clouds. And then underneath the clouds was propped all of these crosses rooted in the earth. And, you know, kind of an image of the cross being what sustains the universe itself. And so my friend saw it and was very interested in this, and so he asked him, well, can you explain that picture to me? This Polish fellow comes back quite quickly and a little offended, says, if I wanted to explain it, I would have written an essay. And so he's a little offended that, you know, this painting was supposed to be put into words. And yet when Socrates tells stories, he's always very quick to take the story and translate it into words. I mean, the kind of the conversion between story and this kind of the conversion between story and prose is very easy for Socrates. And you almost wonder if he tells the stories just to illustrate his prose. But I also like trying to work on my German. I like to try to memorize German jokes. And German jokes, a lot of times you just can't. Because of the wordplay, you can't translate it into English. It just doesn't translate. And so, you know, sometimes I thought, how many stories are that way, where it just doesn't translate? It's a story that tells a story's truth, and somebody says, okay, thanks for the story, but explain it to me. You know, it just doesn't really translate that well. Is there something unique about story? And you did actually make one. Oh yeah, there's one comment you make that seems to point in this direction. It says, the story, while inspired by the Bible, is still fictional, yet contains many life lessons that can teach the reader in a way only a story can. That seems to be implying that there's some things that just don't translate out of stories. So could you give us some examples of perhaps story or elements of story that just don't translate well into anything but story?
I would say that the feeling of passion that is inspired by whether it's in a movie or in a piece of music or just in a story that someone told you, that passion is something that cannot be explained. You can't tell someone, we discussed often, you know, how do you explain the taste of a pineapple to someone? You can't. They have to try it. They have to read it. And stories have to be told in the right way to inspire that passion. So I would say that oftentimes the emotion from a story is something that cannot be elicited any other way. And only a story can. Often it's taught through that feeling, through seeing the characters interact. It's really like watching someone else and being inspired by them and feeling that push to, wow, that's amazing. And that can only be inspired by hearing a story or seeing it or it being recounted to you in the right way.
Well, I mean, taking a simple example from Jesus' ministry, this story of the Good Samaritan. I mean, you read the story of the Good Samaritan, you say, well, why did I need that long story? Be nice to whoever comes along in your life. There you go. All right? So much simpler to state it that way. You can kind of boil it down to some sort of moral maxim like that. But how would you say that, well, I know we're always talking about brevity, and you need, just cut to the chase, just give me the point I'm supposed to learn, and don't make me sit to listen to that whole long tale, because I got to get on to my next Instagram feed. We want brevity, make it quick. What do you lose when you say, okay, I won't tell you the story, just be nice to whoever comes along in your life?
I think you lose, first of all, the interaction between two humans. They were very human. You see the kindness of the Samaritan who, if any of you have met someone who's like a Samaritan, you know just how magnetic that person's love and joy is. And if you've met the man who was laying on the road dead, you would hope that you would go help that man because it's pathetic. He's hurt, he's wounded, he's weak, and the story illustrates that. Jesus was a great storyteller. And as for the part of sitting down and us wanting brevity, the attention span that we have decreased to in this day, watching 15-second videos and thinking that we're going to be fine with that, needs to be increased. We need to be able to sit, to listen, to absorb, to debate, to talk, to take time to just not even pause, to live our lives in a way that is just going through the way God wants us to. A phrase I was always told when I was a kid was, when the world says hurry, God says don't worry. And I mentioned that having to sit down and listen to a story inspires you to take time and really, in no other phrase, enjoy life.
All right, thank you very much. Other questions?
Robert.
I just want to say that was a great paper.
Thank you.
And my question is, do you think that stories play a direct effect onto culture, or culture plays a direct effect on the stories?
Would you give me a specific example of a culture?
So take American culture, for example.
Okay.
Specifically, like the heroism and the ideals of the late 1800s. Would you say that that is a direct effect of culture, or that directly affected the culture after that was starting to gain popularity?
Well, when I look back at how America was founded, discovered, fought for, won, that's real life. That was real life, real wars fought that inspired men in their day, and that passion carried on. I'm reading an autobiography or a biography of George Washington right now, and just hearing everything that he did, it was real life. He lived a story. So in this case, I would say that the culture inspires that heroism because those men and women were heroes. They lived lives of heroes, whether or not they meant to. They were courageous, and they stood for God in the face of adversity. They pursued, I don't know that I would say manifest destiny, but they pursued God, and they trusted Him in everything. And I say those are real life heroes. So in this case, in America, I would have to say that it is culture that inspires the heroism of those stories if you're talking directly about American history.
And what about stories that aren't necessarily based in historical fact and are more like fairy tales, for example? So, let me come up with a good example because there's a few that kind of do this. I'm gonna use the Polar Express for example. Great movie. I love that movie. Does the Polar Express reflect on American culture at the time, or did it play into American culture after that movie came out?
I've only seen that movie once, but from what I do know, it really highlights the beauty of not only a child's imagination, but the magicalness of our childhood when we were told these stories and these fables that inspired that joy on Christmas morning. I think that would have to be another representation of something that's just been carried down and kind of accepted, because after watching that movie, it's fun, but it's not the point of Christmas. It's not, and I would hope that would not be an accurate representation of something that reflects on our culture, because I would hope that Christmas would still focus on the true purpose and the true point of the baby that was born.
Okay.
Anastasia.
Okay, your paper was amazing. I loved hearing you read it. That was super cool.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, so I have a few questions here. So I wondered, for all the examples that you gave, where you were talking about Oedipus and all that, you would give the story itself, and then you would say, the story has a point, has a moral, and you would show how the moral can be seen in like a biblical passage or a verse. So I was wondering, taking the hypothetical scenario that the Bible was written,
Sure.
would stories have a point?
I would have to say no, because God is the purpose of the universe. God is the point of all life, and I believe that if these men had been Christians and they had been as inspired as they were as authors, they would have written amazing Christian stories. I think that stories could still be written, but if there's not a point to existence, why is there a point for a story? Every man just lives to his own pleasure. That's the point of every man. And I said it in a phrase, I believe it was, every man living according to his own moral convictions, or whatever he feels. It can pass day by day. Kind of what we were talking about yesterday, and how the gods were observed to react in Antigone's and Creon's case. They're flippant. They're just always changing. They're nearly human. Imagine if God was like that, but he's not. So I cannot see a world with a purpose without God.
Okay, so given that, would a non-Christian find any point or purpose in reading a book, even if it's a very moral book?
That's an awesome question, which I was hoping to be asked. I would say that if a non-Christian were to read these books, they might be inspired. But the reason that I approach this from a Christian view is that, unfortunately, if you're not a Christian, trying to look at these books and see the point and see why Oedipus was wrong in letting his pride get the best of him, or why selfishness and drunkenness and anger is so wrong, you can only see that from a Christian perspective. Again, like I said, God is the purpose and God is the point. So if God is the point, everything has to be turned back to him, which is why I sought, even in pagan stories, to see God in them. God is in everything, but if you're not a Christian, it's unfortunately very hard to see the point.
So I guess if probably only the Christian who can truly understand books.
Which is why I think it's so important that Christians seek to reach out in ministry with the Bible and in normal life to inspire people in a way that they would not otherwise see.
Okay. And then I was wondering, well, I had two questions that are related. One is if a book without a moral is worth reading, and the second question is if a book can be without a moral.
I think Antigone and Creon might be a tricky example, but kind of the way we were talking about it yesterday, to say, you know, is there a moral if there's only pagan gods? I mean, was there a moral compass, or were they just kind of acting on what they felt, how much they loved their family, and can that be described as morality? I would say I don't know as to whether there's a book that can be written without a moral, but I would say, would there be a point to reading it? Yes, because if you want to see what a world is like without God, if you want to know what it's like to go down the path of sin and to live your life as you want without focusing on God, read that book instead of making the mistake, because it'll help you.
Okay, thank you very much.
Absolutely. Who had their hand up first, do you know? Do you mind if ladies go first?
Absolutely.
All right.
Thank you. I really enjoyed your paper, and like Anastasia said it beautifully. My question is, there have been times when telling stories was like out of fashion, I suppose, and just giving children, especially, just a cut and dry definition of a virtue was thought more important. So if we do read children's stories, it could be like Christ's parables, it could be like a fairy tale. Is it our job as reading them those stories to give them the moral afterward, or would you say it is the part of the child hearing those stories to really think about it and try to grapple with those questions first?
Well, I think the way that my parents would always tell me stories is the way that I'd like to tell my children stories. It would be, you tell the story, you ask them, what do you see in this? What do you see? What can we learn from this? How can you be inspired? The golden rule was something that was taught to me through a story, and I mean, we still live by that today. I think it's tricky and it depends on the child's age, but I believe that you should see what the child sees. See through a child's eyes, you know. Not even Jesus turned the children away to tell when he was telling stories. But I also believe that teaching children and raising them up in the way that they should go so that they will not depart from it is imperative. I know a lot of the times, all of us have heard our parents say, because I said so. We want to know why. We want to know why. And that can often be best depicted when they give us an example of, this is what's going to happen if you don't do what I tell you to do, because I love you more than my own life. And through a story, that's how we see that. I mean, we see that through the Bible. So, does that answer your question?
Yes.
Okay. Alex.
So I was wondering, in accordance with the position you posed in your paper, that stories are worth reading because of the moral or what you can gain from them, are there stories that would, even if there is a moral to be gained from them, absolutely not be worth reading because of the vulgarity contained within them, such as the Reeves or the Miller's Tale from Canterbury Tales, or even stories with more vulgarity than them? Is it even still worth reading those despite the vulgarity contained within them to gain the morals out of them?
No, it's not worth it. Because there is sin in the world, and there are some things our eyes should not see. And there are some things our mind should not be ever exposed to. And we have to stray as far as possible from those. It's hard to discern. It's hard to know. But a heart turned towards God and in line with Him and in a relationship with Him will know and have the conviction, I shouldn't be here. This is too far. And it really comes down a lot of times to knowing your own weakness, to knowing your sins, to knowing where you're going to stumble. If it's too much, put it down. Oedipus might be too much for some people to read, and that's okay. But I do believe that in general, there are some books that cross the line. Dawson.
Very delightful paper. My question is, at the end of your final paragraph, you say, if Christians are told to spend their lives glorifying God, why should they read stories of pride taking God into biblical fiction? And you go on to say, people who don't are in their own world, so trying to get more knowledge and stuck in the world of science, so to speak. So to have real fulfillment, that's why. So can you explain why, for real life fulfillment, you would need to spend time with stories of pride, pagan gods, and biblical fiction, and if you don't have pagan gods, you won't have a life of fulfillment?
I believe I do go on to say that the fulfillment comes from learning to live, not from the stories. I don't think I can agree with even myself, if that's how it looks, that that fulfillment comes from such sinful stories. But learning to live and learning to enjoy life, I've always kind of thought to myself, God didn't give Adam a science book. He gave him a garden, and he gave him his presence. He gave him animals, and he gave him company. If we don't learn to enjoy the beauties of life, there will be so much lost peace and so many lost opportunities. When we think of heaven, we think of being told, well, at least I would hope that you would think of being told, well done, my good and faithful servant, when we fall into the comforting arms of our Savior, not of the golden streets. It's not about the things, it's not about the learning or the knowledge or the everything that you can know. It's not about ending life as Albert Einstein. It is about glorifying God, and oftentimes that is done with a heart that is at peace in life. Does that answer your question?
So it would be because story reading is such an essential part of the experience of the grander story of life that if you're not reading stories within the grand story, you're not gonna know and have fulfillment.
I would say that in our day and age, with so many distractions and so much knowledge and so many things to know, where you're told constantly there's always something to learn, there's always something to be done, that stories can turn our generation back to the eyes of what we're missing, of what we're not getting, which is why GBT can be so beautiful. It makes us take time. I think in a time where you were, say, a farmer, and all you had to do was farm and live, stories might not be so important, but more of just a joy, but they would already know how to live, because they just were living. Does that answer yes? Okay. Any other questions? Dad, you've had your hand up for a while.
In this era of critical theory and postmodernism and deconstruction, a lot of the focus is on the attempt to revise archetypes within stories. Are archetypes real? Do they exist? Are they valid? And are they timeless? You know, I guess that would be one aspect of an archetype, is that it's timeless and true. Are they real because they reflect God's design? And you know, these postmodern attempts to deconstruct these archetypes, will they last? Or is there something in the nature of an archetype that is true to God and therefore will endure in spite of attempts to undermine it?
What do you mean by archetype?
Sorry. It's the recurring types of person that you see within a storyline, especially in timeless stories. Maybe Mr. H can help me out with an explanation of it.
I was going to ask the same question.
Are you asking, will the kind of portrayal of the hero last, or will there become different types of stories? I'm not quite sure what you're asking. Okay. Right. I can see that coming. I can see breaking down of heroes, and I can see accepting and saying, you're weak, it's okay. Not saying, you're weak, let me help you be strong. It's, you're sinful and you're falling, but it's okay, it's gonna be okay, you're gonna get through this. No, it's, I will pull you up, I will help you. I don't need to be the hero, that passion comes from God, but we cannot let men sit in the dust. We can't let the hero fall. We have to glorify the hero. Because there needs to be a hero, because there is only one hero, and that's where we get our passion from. If we stop remembering that there is a hero, if we stop remembering that there is a savior, and there is a reason and a way to get up from the ground, we will live in the ash and we will never rise. And that won't be okay. I can see our society going in that direction, and we will fall and we will crumble. Yes?
Whether or not we should is my mom calls it brain candy. It's books that there's a story that's not really, doesn't really have a moral, but it's just there for the purpose of enjoyment. It's not bad, it's not good, it's just fun to read. Are those worthwhile, worth to read, or are they something that we should just not read because of them?
I think that I have a bookshelf in my room that is still filled with maybe 200 of those books from my childhood. I would never turn those away from my child. I would say read these, learn how to be a friend, learn the golden rule, learn basic morals. Kind of what you asked as to whether we can describe a moral to a child. How do you do that? A lot of times it's through a story. But I believe that those books need to be grown out of, that we need to realize, because if we're stuck in those books, we're stuck in what you might call the milk stage of a Christian faith. Again, all turns back to God and how you're going to grow in faith and taking care of others. So that would be my answer to that. Ari.
So in your paper you said that there's a danger to desiring too much knowledge,
Mhm.
and it's not for man to know everything.
Mhm.
But then my question would be like, how do you know when enough is enough, and how do we put that into practice?
When your knowledge outweighs God. Because if you're putting your knowledge and your desire to know, and I would even say your desire for good grades, above how much you're reading your Bible and how well you're treating your friends, if you're getting so stressed out about a test that you actually snap at someone and end up ruining a friendship, you've gone too far. I understand that it can be hard in this day and age when we are when we desire to go to a good college, to get good grades, to have a good job, to be able to survive. But I can see in so many ways how Satan could work through that to tear you away from God, to say, no, there's something more important in this world, and it looks really important, and you have to survive. Remembering that God will provide, and that there is something so much more important than remembering. If you can balance those, it is hard, but it comes back to having that relationship with God and spending enough time in your word when you know when enough is enough. Hans.
Thank you. Your paper was great. It was vintage Lily. It was passionate and expressive.
Lily-esque.
Yes, that's a good way to put it. I guess I have a lot of questions, and I'll have to pick a couple. And they're surfacing from a certain sort of person in my life that looks at stories, that looks at the fact that I'm going to college as an English major, and sort of raises an eyebrow. And they, on the one hand, I think you've depicted very well the inspirational nature of stories, but I guess I'll put the question in the context of your first two sort of intro italic scenes. So your first one is in Plymouth, and a mother and a daughter are starving, and so the mother, as a solution to that, or sort of in response, pulls out Don Quixote. How is Don Quixote a solution to starvation?
It's not. I point out that there is raging wind, people are dying, it's scary, and the girl is just a child. A lot of the times when, I'm sure a lot of us can remember when we were kids, our parents would tell us stories. My dad would come into our bedroom at night if we were too scared to sleep, and he'd tell us a story. It would calm us down, and that's what I see the mother trying to do, is just, kind of bring her child back to the present, focus with me, and if you can't focus on me, then I know you're young, I know it's scary, but here's a story, here's another world.
Yeah. So I guess obviously that kind of question stems from the sort of person that looks around the world and says, how is a story going to fix the brokenness that we're trying to solve in society? And that's a really big question, I know, in the context of college. It's the sort of thing people are always asking in interviews and whatever. It's the sort of question you get faced with as you move beyond, say, our culture, which has maybe more time for stories and less starvation than some. Moving to your second italic section, that starts with the mid-piles of finished and unfinished homework. Looking around him for a relief from the monotonous task, he brushes away papers, only to find a thick paperback book sitting underneath. He smiles and picks it up, opening it to a bookmarked page, escaping to a world of the sea. This is coming directly from my parents. Is the world of a story, as being an alternative to his homework, really providing a danger for him? Insofar as he is now learning that when life is problematic, he runs to something other than life. In 20 years, when he's married and life is going hard, is he just going to leave his relationship because it's difficult? Is the process of a story training us, instead of saying, all right, I'm going to sit back down and do the rest of my homework, I'm going to sit back down and deal with my life as it is it taking us away from true character and allowing us to simply run from betterment of ourselves?
Well, I think I definitely should have mentioned that the button that he hit on the computer was the save button because he finished his GBT paper, but I would say that is actually a great point to know, that a story should not be an escape. If you're going to have escape, it needs to be God. It needs to be the Bible. Go to a book of the Bible, Daniel, Romans 8, doesn't matter. It needs to be God. Adam and Eve ran to each other. I mean, I made that point. You cannot run to anything but God. Humans will fail you. America will fail you, sin will fail you, God will not. And if you run to him in the hard times, it builds a stronger relationship than you could ever have. There is a danger to escape. We run to Netflix, we run to Instagram, Twitter, we run to Disney Plus, we run to our books, we run to stories, we run to our parents and our friends, we run to anybody else because it's too hard to run to somebody that we can't see. But going to him in those times of struggles and saying, God, it is for your glory. I will do this for you. Again, in reading this story of George Washington, no, it doesn't solve the problems of the world, but it does inspire me to try.
Thank you.
And Brooke.
So this is the same question you asked of the authors at the beginning of your paper. Why did you write this paper, and why do we need it?
At the end of the story, I talk about living, and I'm going to be completely honest with this question. A lot of the times through GPT-5, laughter, when we talked about love, or when we talked about relationships, and those are so vital. I see love, and I see good relationships, and I see men of God, and I see women who would fall on their knees with a friend in prayer, rather than take them and say, "Oh, he's so cute, he just broke your heart." You know, we'll just. I've seen friends talk about slashing a guy's tire because he broke up with somebody. That's shallow. We cannot be shallow. So in following the reality and the beauty of just living, that includes scary relationships and scary love and scary working through things with people and scary admitting that, okay, I'm at peace beneath this peach tree. It's beautiful. That's it. That's all. To not laugh at that, because life is not all about knowing everything. And if you get sucked up in that, you'll lose some beautiful moments. Does that answer your question? No. Any other questions? Yes.
Do you believe, or do you think, that Aesop's fables teach morals and good principles?
I think that if you would like to see what a world might look like of selfishness and pride, even if it is shown a lot of the times by animals, that you can go to those fables. I think they warn us of what's going to happen if we're selfish, or what's going to happen if we're prideful or distracted. I don't think that fables like that are going to necessarily teach us the morals that would be the opposite of the pride. He finishes his tale of the raven and the cheese when she drops the cheese to speak of, pride's going to be your downfall. But what's the opposite of that? So I would say stories like that, I would love for them to be finished with the moral, the tale that actually says, here's what you should do instead. But I think in a way that's what parents are for, and that's what discussion and debates and places like GBT are for. So, does that answer your question?
Yes.
Thank you. Yes, Veronica.
I think it was Brett's question about escapism in these stories, or maybe it was Hans, but so the characters in your paper, they were not turning to stories as purely a means of escape. They were turning to stories because they recognize the people in those stories as also going through familiar struggles and seeing them as more of an inspiration. Is that what you meant?
Every story was a little bit abstract. I know the boy finishing his homework and sitting back and escaping to a book was an example of what I think that we should be like today instead of picking up our phone. I mean, maybe a book or a Bible would be better than our phone. I think that the one with the children in the play just reminded me of GBT, and it made me smile to think that that's exactly what we're doing. We're discussing these things. And the girl at college is actually more of a self-representation. That's how I felt at the college I'm going to, and being there and being so inspired by people is something I wanted to share in my own short story.
All right, thank you.
And there's Sarah.
So I love your paper.
Thank you.
So earlier you mentioned how different people are able to tick different parts of stories better than other people. How if a story is really intense, that might be too much for a certain person, or another person might be able to take it. So my question is, how do you draw the line between a story, let's say that's really gory, it's like a horror story. How do you draw the line for this is too much for me, to that this is an awful book, no one, a Christian should not read this because it represents evil and that we should just stay away from this?
I think it kind of comes back to what I said to Alex, not muting your conscience. Never put your conscience on mute, especially if you're in your word enough to know the truths of God's word. It's so easy to say in, the glimpse of the moment, oh, I'm having fun, oh, it's fine, oh, I'll just try it, oh, it's just once, oh, it's not that bad. You ever hear that coming out of your mouth? Run the other direction. Put the book down. Don't give in to anything that you think could make you stumble. Be the person that says, no, I'm stepping away from the situation and I don't care if it makes me look like a weakling. I would rather glorify God with my life. It does come down to a relationship with God. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
So in your paper, you talk about why do we read this? Why do we write? Why do we read the stories?
Mm-hmm.
And could you make a connection to that about the idea, the thought that ideas matter, and the impact that might have on culture?
Yes. Kind of ties back to what Sarah and Alex asked me about, knowing where to draw the line, knowing which ideas are who are going to affect who and how. You can't know everybody's heart. But the ideas that a culture has, for instance, what's going on right now, everybody has a different idea, everybody has a different interpretation, and everybody has a different approach. But no matter how we like it, it affects our society. It affects how we walk around, how we interact with people. I mean, if you've walked into a store recently, you'll know. You're wondering who you're going to get glances from, who's going to start a fight, who's going to be the dramatic one. Ideas matter. How you think matters, but more than all of that, how you deal with them matters. How you interact with your fellow man, because that's another soul that you're dealing with. You cannot approach someone with an idea that you have and automatically assume that if they don't agree with you that they're wrong. You could be right for all you know, but if you go about it the wrong way, you have in no way converted someone. You have only turned them further from the truth, especially when Christians approach another man and say, you're not a Christian? Okay, fine, you're wrong. How does that make Christians look? To know how you approach another man and express your ideas, and to say how you're going to think of me can determine so much, even your eternal soul. Does that answer your question? Okay. And does anybody else have any questions? Okay.
Thank you very much.